Dialogue this afternoon turns us to John Stuart Mill, author of On Liberty, often considered a classic statement of the contribution of economic and personal liberty to human flourishing, as well as the author of the classic Principles of Political Economy, which served U.S. college presidents well for decades as a main text in the course on moral philosophy that they taught their college's senior class. You may have noticed as you walked in that a copy of the Principles of Political Economy was out in the entranceway. That is a first edition, 1848, and it's open to one of the chapters that will be mentioned in the dialogue tonight. But Mill's relationship with those who hold economic liberty dear is conflicted. For example, Ludwig von Mises said that Mill was full of feeble compromises and became, Mises said, the great advocate of socialism. To assist us in considering Mill on economic liberty, we have two of today's foremost historians of economic thought who have both written extensively on Mill. Sandra Peart is Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies at the University of Richmond and holds the E. Claiborne Robbins Distinguished Professorship in Leadership Studies. She also serves as president of the International Adam Smith Society. Her most recent book is Escape from Democracy, the Role of Experts and the Public in Economic Policy. And she also writes articles on leadership in higher education, as well as ethics and economics for outlets like the New York Times, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and elsewhere. I'll take a moment to add that Sandy was the co-creator with our mutual friend David Levy of the Summer Institute for the Preservation of the History of Economic Thought, which over 15 years supported not only the preservation of the discipline of studying the history of economics, but the thriving of young scholars. I'm happy to say that through the efforts of my colleagues here at ASU, Scott Scheel and Tyler DeRoche, both here in the audience tonight, and the support of both the History of Economics Society and Skettle, we are relaunching the Institute, appropriately retitled as the Winter Institute, and rescheduled as well, as the Winter Institute for the History of Economic Thought, and plan to make it a regular feature of the Center's activities in January each year. Our other guest this evening is Joseph Persky, Professor of Economics at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Joe combines a long-standing interest in the history of economic thought with a career of research and activism in the field of urban and regional economics and planning. He recently published The Political Economy of Progress, John Stuart Mill and Modern Radicalism, as well as articles on the economic geography of intergenerational mobility, and with Kirsten Madden, the economic thought of British Women's Cooperative Guild. Our format this evening will include a short presentation by each of our speakers, followed by a dialogue about the issues raised that will be led by ASU's own Professor Peter Demarnoff. After that dialogue, there'll be time for Q&A. Between the two presentations and the dialogue, there'll be a short break. Fortunately, there's things at the back for you to go and grab, because we're going to take this podium off the stage and put chairs up here like we did for the Hayek-Keynes discussion, so that there can be a bit of a dialogue moderated by Peter. I'll turn it over to Sandra.
Thanks very much, Ross. Can you all hear me? Is this all right? It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me just say that I think that it's wonderful that Ross is here and doing so many great things. We've known each other for a very long time, and I'm glad to see that he's in a much warmer spot than he used to be. And I do look forward to coming back to the Winter Institute, which I'm sure I'm always going to call the Summer Institute next year. So I'm here to talk to you about John Stuart Mill on economic liberty. I have some remarks that I'm going to present to you, a few slides that will perhaps liven it up a little bit. John Stuart Mill was perhaps the quintessential liberal of the 19th century. He was also the great social reformer of that time. Among the many liberal causes associated with Mill, we may consider the following: the defense of the abolition of slavery, the repeal of the Corn Laws, the extension of the franchise and property rights to women, the Governor Eyre controversy, and the question of birth control. Mill was at the center of each of those debates, sometimes on the winning side and sometimes in a losing coalition. His position on property rights and socialism bears particular emphasis, perhaps because it remained a live issue for the 20th century and beyond. It was this, more than any other topic, that has keenly interested scholars. And it's here, as Ross alluded to, perhaps more than anywhere else, that Mill's center of gravity, as Sam Hollander has put it, is so difficult to find. In my time with you today, I plan to make the case that the center of gravity issue arises at least in part from the instrumental nature of Mill's notion of freedom, economic freedom. Economic freedom is valuable in his mind as a means to progress, but not simply to economic progress. Indeed, more important to Mill, in his mind, is the human development, the human progress that arises in the course of expanded or at least fulsome economic choice. My case will rest in significant measure then on Mill's remarks in On Liberty. As such, it will intersect significantly with his relationship with the woman who was his best friend and later became his wife, Harriet Taylor. There too, I'll say, scholars have had some difficulty finding Mill's center of gravity with respect to her influence. Why might this bear on the center of gravity issue? If choice is a means to human development, it's not in and of itself a good thing. There's a presumption that choice is good, but it can be curtailed in specific instances without significant repercussions, with minimal overall impact on human development. Only if it's generally curtailed, if one is unable to govern oneself, one is kept as a child or forced by public opinion to act without exercising real choice, then, and only then, human development is thwarted and society loses the richness that comes from diversity of thought. So I will argue that for Mill, economic freedom is important because it is a means by which people learn and become fully developed, fully human, one might say. Choice is a sort of exploratory data analysis mechanism by which one learns to compare, to discern, to observe, to decide, to stick to a decision, and so on. Choice is also the key to combating uniformity and dullness. So that'll be my second main point. Only by enabling choice do we have a society of fully developed humans who are individuals. Only then do we have individuality. Freedom of speech is one side of this, to which I'll briefly return near the end of my remarks, but so too is economic choice. So I begin with a passage from Mill's On Liberty that emphasizes the important role that choice plays in forming humans, in making humans. He who lets the world, Mill writes, or his own portion of it, and that's quite interesting, choose his plan of life for him, has no need of any other faculty than the ape-like one of imitation. He who chooses his plan for himself employs all of his faculties. He must use observation to see, reasoning and judgment to foresee, activity to gather materials for decision, discrimination to decide, and when he has decided, firmness and self-control to hold to his deliberate decision. It's important to realize that the ape is the alternative to the human here. Those who do not experience a life of economic freedom, of choice, do not develop into real humans. At the time, some commentators argued contra Mill that some groups of people would never fully develop and thus shouldn't be offered economic freedom. So were they to be offered economic freedom, they simply could not learn. That was the argument in opposition to Mill. That's what he's arguing against. Many of the images of the time show non-fully humans with ape-like characteristics or actual apes pretending to be humans. Those images are the visual representation of the opposition to Mill. They're what he's arguing against. And this is Mr. G. Orilla. It's an ape pretending to be a fully rational Irishman. Again, this ape-human dichotomy mattered. The major debate of the 19th century was about who can become a non-human ape. Mill held that anyone can learn to choose. Anyone can become a fully developed human via choice, including former slaves in the West Indies, the Irish, and even including women. In opposition to Mill, some held that the Irish would never learn to choose. Second, it's important to note that these debates had significant results in terms of how people were actually treated, how groups of people were treated by policy. The debates weren't simply debates among academicians arguing about a model. If the Irish could not become fully human, they were to be ruled by the English. This is a cartoon from Punch. It's John Bright, who's with Mill in these debates on Mill's side, who thinks that the Irish can become fully human, but he's portrayed here as a medicine man selling junk medicine to the Irish, whose characteristics, if you look at the kind of bulging eyes and the protruding jaws, are somewhat ape-like. That's by Sir John Tenniel, who received a knighthood for drawing Irish people like this over and over again, and who always drew the Irish as inferior human beings. Mill's participation in the debates and what we today would call his life choices were extremely courageous. He made these life choices, specifically his very unusual relationship with the married woman who, as I say, was his best friend and later became his wife, Harriet Taylor. And he participated in the debates, notwithstanding what he knew would be the reactions of his family, his friends, his colleagues, and the public, notwithstanding the tyranny of public opinion, as he put it. His words about uniformity, about the tyranny of public opinion, reflect the deep associated personal and professional cost that he himself suffered. Indeed, Mill lost the companionship and the love of his family and his friends as he chose to live in an unusual relationship. What he did get was Harriet. The hurt and rejection that resulted from the relationship were significant. John Roebuck wrote in 1835 of the suppressed titter that went round the room when Harriet and John Stuart walked into a dinner party. Mill's friendship with Roebuck was the first casualty of the affair. Relations between the Carlyles and the Mill became superficial by the early 1840s, and an open break with Carlyle occurred in 1846. Mill and Taylor began to withdraw from their acquaintances. They had always gone to soirees and dinner parties to talk about political economy, but they simply withdrew from their public, their friends and so on. Sarah Austin, Harriet Martineau, Mrs. Grote, and Lady Ashburton all became people they no longer associated with. Beginning in 1846, with regard to a newspaper article and then recurring frequently thereafter, Mill attributed his work as a joint production with Harriet Taylor. Fallout from the relationship continued. Mill's brother, George Grote Mill, broke off relations with them. Harriet Taylor wrote to him in 1851, "I do not answer your letter because you deserve it. That you certainly do not. But because though I am quite inexperienced in the best way of receiving or replying to an affront, I think that in this, as in all things, frankness and plain speaking are the best rule." A letter from Mill's sister, Mary Elizabeth Coleman, conveys only a fraction of the tragedy that ensued. And now, goodbye. If this should close all intercourse between us as I think possible, it will be to me very painful, but at least the sting will be wanting of thinking that I have shrunk from the duty of honesty toward you. And so it was a tragedy. We do sometimes close off family relationships and friendships because of the choices we make. And certainly Mill did. So Mill's views on economic freedom, property exchange, and liberty were much influenced by the discussions with the woman who became his wife, Harriet Taylor. They were also much influenced by his friendship with the French socialists, especially Gustave Dactal. Less recognized in the commentary, his views on economic liberty presupposed lessons from his views on speech. Discussion with those who hold different points of view is the means to exploration and deep learning, he writes. The counterpart to this view in the economy is that humans learn most deeply through trial and error. Only through choices do humans gain habits of foresight, of saving, and of work. Choice that is dictated by public opinion, or by parents, or by convention, or by a spouse, do not allow the ape-like to become a human. Can you tell I'm quite interested in the Irish? My grandmother was a Casey. Yet another cartoon, again by Sir John Tenniel. Inferiors who can't make rational choices, such as the Irish, should not get uppity. This is a cartoon which threatens the Irish if they continue to be rebellious. Why does this matter? In the rest of my time, I will argue that for Mill, economic choice in its most enlarged form was key to ensuring individuality, nonconformity, and variation. And that variation is in turn the key to ensuring a vibrant society filled with rich individuality and even idiosyncrasy. It enabled genius to flourish, but it also enabled you and me, non-geniuses, to become our best selves. In sum, for Mill, choice is the key to human development. The human faculties, he writes, of perception, of judgment, of discriminative feeling, mental activity, and even moral preference are exercised only in making a choice. He who does anything because it is the custom, makes no choice. He gains no practice either in discerning or in desiring what is best. He will not become his best self. Absence of choice results in forced uniformity. The analogy again is to the enslaved, to the animal. Those who do not choose are yoked. Thus the mind itself is bowed to the yoke. Even in what people do for pleasure, conformity is the best thing thought of. They like in crowds, they exercise choice only among things commonly done. Peculiarity of taste, eccentricity of conduct are shunned equally with crimes, until by dint of not following their nature, their own nature, they have no nature to follow. They shrink into non-humans. Their human capacities are withered and starved. They become incapable of any strong wishes or native pleasures, and are generally without either opinions or feelings of home growth or properly their own. I have some more detail on Harriet Taylor because I'm quite interested in her, but I will not subject you to that. I wanted simply to say that Hayek gets the relationship badly wrong. There are many things about Hayek that I do admire, but this is not one of them. Hayek argues that Harriet Taylor kind of pulled John Stuart Mill into writing about women and marriage and property rights. This early essay is something that Harriet actually asked Mill to write, explain to me your views on women. And Mill himself says that she was drawn to him because of his views held very early in his life on marriage and property rights. So I want to just make that correction. I won't give you a lot of detail about the chapters in his principles and the revisions over time, but I did want to say that what stands out, at least to me, is Mill's sense that new economic arrangements, which might be tried and indeed must be tried, or at least he hoped would be tried, as well as his increasing sense that present property arrangements and economic arrangements left very little room for economic choice or liberty among the laboring classes. Thus he wrote, "I confess I am not charmed with the ideal of life held out by those who think that the normal state of human beings is that of struggling to get on, that of the trampling, crushing, elbowing, and treading on each other's heels, which form the existing type of social life. And he does not think that those are the most desirable lot of humankind, or anything but the disagreeable symptoms of one of the phases of industrial progress." So thus he advocated, and this is part of why it's hard to get a hold of his center of gravity, an inheritance tax, which in his view does not overly restrict human development or overly restrict economic liberty. On the other hand, he writes, we may suppose this better distribution of property attained by the joint effect of the prudence and frugality of individuals and the system of legislation favoring equality of fortunes, so far as that is consistent with the just claim of the individual to the fruits, whether great or small, of his or her own industry. So learning prudence, learning how to make good decisions, plus redistribution is his notion of, or argument for, or suggestion for the future of capitalism. Skipping over a few pages here to make sure we have time for discussion. I mentioned that I would return to the idea of discussion, of speech choice and improvement. Consistent with his views on economic choice as an exploratory device, Mill also believed that discussion was the means by which we learn most deeply. And we also fortify ourselves against bias, something he refers to in his 1867 speech as inaugural rector of St. Andrew's College. As I noted at the outset, Mill's viewed all people as being capable, as he put it, of being guided to their own improvement by conviction or persuasion. And then he goes on to say, rectifying mistakes by discussion and experience. Not by experience alone. There must be discussion to show how experience is to be interpreted. Wrong opinion and practices gradually yield to fact and argument. But facts and arguments, to produce any effect on the mind, must be brought before it. For Mill, we come to know a thing by knowing what is said about it. The only way in which a human being, he writes, can make some approach to knowing the whole of a subject is by hearing what can be said about it by persons of every variety of opinion, and studying all modes in which it can be looked at by every character of mind. If instead we simply believe what we are told, we fail fully to understand the proposition, and our belief might well be called superstition. It's important to know and learn from our critics, to develop that steady habit, as he writes, of correcting and completing our own opinion by collating it with those of others. More than this, and this is really interesting, discussion leads to moderation, although here Mill suggests that the incentives are asymmetrically aligned. In a twist on Adam Smith's theme, Mill argued that those who speak against received wisdom must practice moderation more systematically than those who hold received opinions. In general, opinions contrary to those commonly received, he suggests, can only obtain a hearing by studied moderation of language and the most cautious avoidance of unnecessary offense, from which they hardly ever deviate, even in a slight degree, without losing ground, while unmeasured vituperation, employed on the side of the prevailing opinion, really does deter people from professing contrary opinions and from listening to those who profess them. a few concluding thoughts. Without choice, for Mill, the social toll is enormous. It is not by wearing down into uniformity, he writes, that all that is individual in themselves, but by cultivating it and calling it forth within the limits imposed by the rights and interests of others, that human beings become a noble and beautiful object of contemplation. And strengthening the tie which binds every individual to the race. So actually, discussion and choice make people social, more social. There's a very Smithian argument here. By making the race infinitely better worth belonging to, in proportion to the development of his individuality, each person becomes more valuable to himself and is therefore capable of being more valuable to others. As I said at the outset, Mill paid very dearly personally for his arguments and his choices. He also paid professionally, as this caricature suggests, for advocating that women be included as full participants in economic liberty and discussion. This is Mill being ridiculed for suggesting that women be included as persons. Pray clear the way here for these persons, is the line at the bottom of that cartoon. Yet the discussion tradition that began with Mill and continues through the work of Frank Knight, James Buchanan, and Amartya Sen suggests that there may be real and unappreciated benefits associated with discussion and choice. Adam Smith had emphasized the development of a moral sense that emerges as one begins to see oneself as a part, and only a small part, of the universe through choice and interaction. Mill accepted this argument and added to it. Conversation and choice are corrective for Mill. Discussion and choice yield insights into bias and yield profound learning. Choice helps us become better people. Mill takes a step beyond Smith to suggest that through choice and discussion, one becomes aware and self-aware. One may change one's position in the course of a discussion. One may change one's consumption patterns as a result of choices made and learning. More recently, experimental evidence confirms these insights and strongly suggests that discussion facilitates cooperation with others when private and group interests are not fully aligned. Though parties may begin as only self-interested entities, they come to perceive their interconnectedness in the course of discussion and via making economic choices. Mill's ideas have important implications for today's world, as they did in his own. Thank you very much. There's a step at the front if you want it.
Can you hear me? Yes. Oh, wow. I can too. Let's see where we are here. If I push here, oh, that looks good. So I'm Joe Persky. It's great to be here. Thanks to Ross for bringing us together, especially with Sandy. We're really lucky that she's here. A Mill Scholar of the first rank. So this is going to be a talk about economic liberty. More specifically, it's a talk about the ideas of John Stuart Mill, it better be, perhaps the most famous advocate of liberty. Our focus will be Mill's conception of economic liberty and his speculations as to its evolution over time. The central claim is that his political economy of progress, in his political economy of progress, Mill anticipated that the Industrial Revolution, which was relatively new at the time, would lead to a broad redefinition of the employment relationship what we all do at work, and would result in a major expansion of liberty. That's going to be the claim. So here's John Stuart Mill in 1870, I guess 3 years before his death. This is a point I want to make especially for the younger people in the audience. That may seem like a long time ago, but here's a timeline. There's John Stuart Mill. When I was born in 1944, there I am. I have the little picture at the end. When I was born in 1944, Bertrand Russell was the major name in social philosophy at the time. Bertrand Russell was born in 1872, 1 year before Mill died, and Bertrand Russell was Mill's godson. So here what we have, so when I was born, Russell was already an older man. He didn't die till 1970. In just those 3 lifetimes, right, we get back to Mill. That's not that long, right? 3 lifetimes just isn't that long. Now, Mill was born in 1806, and the Industrial Revolution at that time was maybe 25 or 30 years old, depending on how you reckon it. That makes Mill very much part of a relatively new and ongoing, still ongoing for sure, conversation about what to make of the promise of the Industrial Revolution. Here I've got 3 inventors down here who added to that promise. Hargreaves, Arkwright, and Crompton, who brought spinning into the modern age. As history goes, this question is quite new. It's not an old question, it's a new question. It's coeval with less than the 3 lifetimes, Mill, Russell, and myself. And it remains unresolved. We are still in the midst of this discussion. Mill is part of this conversation in a way that even Adam Smith, despite his amazing intuitions, probably is not. Smith, understandably, could only partially anticipate the amazing productivity that was going to be released by the Industrial Revolution. Mill is part of this conversation in a way that many of the philosophers of, say, the 17th and 18th century, the Enlightenment, here Locke and Montesquieu, can't be. They just didn't know about the Industrial Revolution, let alone the ancients, say Aristotle and Cicero here. They aren't part of this conversation, but Mill is. Just to drive it home, here's a graph of the GDP per capita in Great Britain going back to 1270. And if it went back further, maybe it would go down a little bit, but how much could it go down, right? That's 0 right there. It's moving along here, and we get to the middle of the 18th century, and then it takes off. That's the Industrial Revolution. That's what we are coping with. That's the world we're trying to deal with. What is it going to amount to? It's hard to imagine much serious talk of progress before the Industrial Revolution. There may have been some people talking about it, but who knows what they actually meant. We're talking about progress based on this huge material upswing that was made possible by that revolution. And that's what opens up the promise and prospects of modern times. And Mill is modern, if he's nothing else. This is a great picture by, of all people, Andy Warhol, who recognized something in Mill that I don't think other people are very clear about. Mill is modern indeed, wrestling to put the pieces of the puzzle of progress into a coherent picture of the future, right? Here's this giant change that occurred in the 50 years before he was born, and it's going forward. He sees it going forward. What is it going to be? So as we wrestle with this, and here too, you've already seen this picture today, I think. I should say that Mill with Harriet Taylor wrestled with this question, for he especially credits her, goes out of his way to credit her with contributing central ideas on his view, on what emerged as his view of progress and liberty. And we will be considering those ideas this afternoon, right? Still afternoon. And while pundits, now this picture, I think, was a cartoon of a review of your book. Yes, right? And it's a nice one, I think. There's Mill and Harriet Taylor. While pundits, and perhaps a few Nobel Prize winners too, have ridiculed their relationship, it is clear that she moved him in the direction of a more optimistic theory of progress. He provided a lot of the economic content, and she encouraged him into a more optimistic view of progress. All right. Now, what is the connection between progress and economic liberty? Mill certainly accepted the classical economic conception championed by, among others, by the utilitarian Jeremy Bentham. And in case you have any doubt, that is Jeremy Bentham. I think they put a wax head on him to make it a little more palatable. But that's his skeleton down there underneath. What can I say? He had some odd ideas. He had an essay on the uses of the dead, right? So something worth reading sometime. But Bentham certainly thought that the expansion of economic liberty and security had contributed to the emergence of the Industrial Revolution, right? And so that's one way liberty plays into this discussion. This type of liberty is what Isaiah Berlin calls negative liberty. It is the very core of Mill's famous essay on liberty, with its injunction to do no harm and to limit coercion on individuals, right? So Mill certainly picks up that theme. Berlin contrasts negative liberty with positive liberty, which adds to the lack of coercion, the negative liberty, the enlargement of choice, we talked a little bit about choice already, and the expansion of self-government, which we haven't talked about much yet this afternoon. Berlin and many conservatives worry that these two types of liberty are perhaps incompatible. But Mill is considerably more optimistic. In his utilitarianism, his essay on utilitarianism, and his and Harriet Taylor's chapter that's sitting out there in the lobby on the likely future of the laboring classes, he presents an understanding of progress centered on an evolutionary development of justice. This is where we're going to come down. For Mill, this expansion of justice promises not only a broadening of negative liberty that, say, Berlin would appreciate, but also a broadening of positive liberties. What was once mere expediency, and that is Mill's term. He talks about, in history, people did things because they were expedient, they had to do them. Perhaps they had to do them for survival, perhaps because they were in very limited situations. But what was once mere expediency, over time, we come to recognize as injustice, especially as the economy improves and grows. Progress had expanded justice as the economy evolved from slavery, I don't know what happened there, to feudalism, to capitalism. All three of those represented improvements in justice. But Mill did not expect and this is an important point, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more today, did not expect capitalism to be the final stage of history. He based this prediction squarely on his political economy of progress that I want to say a few words about. It starts with a theory of the falling rate of profit. Interestingly enough, Mill is hardly unusual among major economists to have a theory of the falling rate of profit. He shares parts of it with Adam Smith, with David Ricardo, with Karl Marx, with Keynes. Mill too, all of them have a theory that says the rate of profit is going to fall. Mill had such a theory as well. Okay, so that's going to be one part of it. If we go to the 19th century and look at Ricardo's theory, based in large part on the work of Malthus, here's a picture of Malthus. If we go to Ricardo's theory of a falling rate of profit, growth in the economy, the accumulation of capital, that's what Ricardo was talking about, increased population, increased therefore land rents, and squeezed profits. We could do a couple of classroom lectures on that theory. And that's the way Ricardo thought about his theory of the falling rate of profit. Mill was hopeful that this would not happen that way. He was very respectful of Ricardo always, but he was hopeful it would not happen that way. He was very worried about Malthusian population dynamics, that population would be out of control if we have growth, but he really hoped that the labor, and worked to try and guarantee that the laboring classes would take control of their own expansion, of their own population growth. It got him in trouble when he was young, he backed off, but he always was clear on this, on the point that the working classes had to get control of their population growth. If and only this occurred, they got control of their population growth, then capital accumulation was going to have a different result than what Ricardo had feared in terms of land rents going up and all the surplus, all the profit going to the landlords. Instead, using Ricardo's own profit-wage trade-off, Mill argued that what would happen would be wages would rise because there'd be all this accumulation of capital and they'd be bidding for the workers. Wages would rise. That would push profits down, according to Ricardo's own theory. And as the profit rate approached zero, and here's the critical element, the investment rate would drop as owners of capital lose interest in expanding reproduction. So one of the things Mill was worried about, or came out of his political economy, was that profit rates would fall and owners would start pulling away from investment. We'll come back to that. The second major element of his theory, at the same time, a result of major trends in religion, urbanization, and literacy, workers were becoming more increasingly self-aware. And Mill was going to be very positive about this growth of self-awareness. We just heard how important that was to Mill. Education often led workers to question the authority and institutional forms of the government, right, on the side of the state. Many pushed for greater political participation, most notably in Great Britain, at least in the Chartist movement. At the same time, and key to the argument here, indeed the second part of the argument, the first part is the falling rate of profit. The second part was that workers increasingly were questioning the authority of their employers. Many asked, why shouldn't democracy, this is that third part of liberty, be extended into the workplace. Self-government extended into the workplace. Why shouldn't workers combine, perhaps in producer cooperatives, and thus expand their liberty? Mill was very positive about this possibility. It's a simple fact. I mean, if you read the first few chapters of the Principles and you read the last few chapters of the Principles, you can miss it. But right there in the middle, it's very clear that Mill sympathized with these questions that workers were asking. Mill and Harriet Taylor. And he saw such moves as fundamentally consistent with the predicted trend of falling profits. So workers are looking to be more engaged in their workplace at the same time that, according to Mill, owners were going to be pulling out of their investments. As owners of capital withdrew from active roles in production, the progressive upshot, according to Mill, would be a broad move towards cooperative production. Mill saw such developments as complementary to the emergence of a stationary state, whole other lecture, and as an attractive expansion, this is our point here, of meaningful liberty. This is early cooperative, the Hebden Bridge Fustian Manufacturing Society. I like that picture, okay. Mill and his wife drew heavily in their chapter on the laboring classes on the work of George Holyoake, pictured here, who was a historian at the time and a strong figure in the cooperative movement. In making this turn towards emphasizing the possibility that cooperatives were going to be a major institutional development in the future, Mill effectively asserted the importance of positive liberty and especially the expansion of self-government into the workplace. For Mill, this was the direction of progress made possible by what? By the Industrial Revolution, right? That's where the Industrial Revolution was leading. Who could object? Well, lots of people could object, and if you've been following along. Most notably, perhaps, in the modern period, the philosopher Robert Nozick, in his Anarchy, State, and Utopia, here he is. Like Berlin, Nozick has little sympathy for arguments about positive liberty. Building on the natural law tradition, Nozick constructs a theory of just entitlement focused on justice in acquisition and justice in transfer. We won't go into all the details there. But he's basically talking about voluntary transactions. He also acknowledges that holdings generated by other means must be subject to rectification, that if you've done it under the table, if you've done anything nasty that goes against the basic rules, that Nozick says that has to be rectified, but he's rather vague as to how actually that rectification is to be achieved. If one lives in a minimalist state, which Nozick outlines for us, that enforces property rights based on these principles, then one has liberty, according to Nozick. This is a negative kind of liberty that Berlin anticipated. Any expansion of the state beyond this minimal role necessarily encroaches on liberty. At a pragmatic level, this approach runs aground of the obvious illegitimacy of many major transactions in the past, if you read the history books. Mill, as well as Bentham, and virtually all utilitarians, recognize that such a history, scarred as it is by chicanery, fraud, and violence, will not support the justice of the private property distribution that we see in the real world. There's going to have to be some other basis for that. Here's an example of that history. This is the enclosure movement in England, which certainly lacked Nozickian principles in its eventual carrying out. But put this aside, no one really takes Nozick's writings as an actual program. Rather, they are meant to tell us something about justice and liberty. So we need to look for a deeper critique. Nozick goes so far as to attempt a rationalization of voluntary slavery. And this becomes a critical issue in this whole discussion that we're getting into. The obvious fact that the voluntary slave has accepted a sharp reduction in the range of day-to-day choices plays no role in Nozick's moral evaluation of the transaction. Most of us find Nozick's argument dubious. While we can appreciate the type of historical life situation that might drive someone to voluntarily accept slavery, say through debt peonage or some other institution, we judge the world with voluntary slavery as one with far less freedom, almost by definition, than the world without. That such a desperate act might even be considered, characterizes an economy that generates it as incapable of sustaining meaningful economic freedom. Okay, we got to speed this up, huh? All right, well, I won't go into detail, but here's G.A. Cohn, who takes up Mill's side, at least in this debate. G.A. Cohn, a serious political philosopher who died recently. Basically, Cohn says, it's not just a question of voluntary slavery. The same issues that make us balk when we look at the issue of voluntary slavery also make us balk when we look at the employment relation as we see it in most places in the present. If not to the same extent, but in much the same way as under voluntary slavery, the workers are forced to subordinate themselves and their identities. And this is something Mill is very much aware of. Even if all previous transactions had been just, workers are forced to accept a situation which greatly limits their personal freedom. It's just clear. Under the circumstances, Cohn, following Mill, concludes that we might seriously consider other social organizations, such as cooperatives, which, while admittedly limiting the liberty of some, they will, no doubt about that, will greatly expand the liberty of most. Interestingly, Nozick himself has a chapter, a section on worker control. He felt he had to include that, which I do think is interesting. But the tenor of his discussion is highly defensive and I don't think very persuasive. He argues, well, look, people in symphony orchestras accept a lot of subordination, but it doesn't seriously affect their self-esteem. In fact, he gives three groups: symphony orchestras, army draftees, not exactly an average group, and those successfully climbing the organizational ladder there. They also seem to be able to subordinate themselves without giving up their self-esteem. In the end, he asks, I don't find this terribly convincing, but in the end he does ask an important question, which is why, if cooperatives are so attractive, don't we see more of them occurring just from voluntary decisions by workers in the economy? Why indeed? So we go back to Mill. Mill had two elements to his theory of progress. One was going to be a falling rate of profit. The other was workers looking for more self-esteem, pushing on their employers to give up control in the workplace. Neither of these tendencies has proven as strong as Mill anticipated. All economists make mistakes, in case you didn't know that, right? And Mill certainly was no exception. Technological change has allowed real wages to rise and profits to stay robust. Ambitious schemes for cooperatives under these circumstances, such as those of, this is G.D.H. Cole from Great Britain, and his group was the Guild Socialists. Their schemes came basically to naught. Whatever cooperatives' advantages, they do have advantages with respect to morale, they suffer from considerable disadvantages in the areas of risk-taking and investment. We could talk more about that. My own suspicion is that the failure of cooperatives has resulted from the difficulty they have in attracting strong leadership, entrepreneurial leadership, when in competition with capitalist firms capable of promising much larger rewards. And I think on this point, there's a brilliant article by Steve Margolin a number of years ago called What Do Bosses Do? And it's worth taking a look at. Notice in Mill's theory, this wouldn't have been an issue because the owners of capital were voluntarily pulling out of production, leaving the landscape open to the expansion of workers. All right, I am getting close to the end here. What's to be done? Are we to accept that the Industrial Revolution, that's where we started, leaves us with little liberty in the workplace? I mean, is that the conclusion? Perhaps, as any number of authors have claimed, the modern workplace is necessarily based on a heavy discipline and authoritarianism. Indeed, the classical liberal William Hutt, over here, who doesn't get enough credit, I think, in the current discussions, hypothesized that consumer sovereignty, a term that he coined, you may have heard consumer sovereignty, it has nothing to do with all this fancy mathematical economics. He coined it to talk about the quid pro quo that workers accept discipline in the workplace in exchange for liberty and consumption, freedom and consumption. Perhaps so, but we do ourselves little good to sell our economic liberty so cheaply. At least that would be the position I think that Mill would take, and that certainly I'm taking here. If Mill was overly optimistic about the progressive path of the economy, that doesn't imply that we should simply ignore the realities of the employment relationship in the here and now. Here's some place to start. I mean, it's not good to end on a down note. Here's some place to start. Elizabeth Anderson, a philosopher from University of Michigan, has recently come out with a book called Private Government that's very relevant to the discussion we're having now, How Employers Rule Our Lives. She suggests a series of major reforms that we should look at seriously for bringing more liberty, more freedom into the workplace. She talks about improving the ability of exit. In particular, she's worried about non-compete clauses. She talks about expanding the role of law in the workplace, concepts such as due process. She talks about constitutional rights, a workers' bill of rights. She talks about increasing voice, getting back to Mill's theme of perhaps putting workers onto boards of directors and the like. So where are we headed? Quo vadimus, where are we going? What are we to make of the promise of the Industrial Revolution? Mill erred in the forecast he based on his progressive political economy, but in developing his theory, he raised fundamental issues about the employment relation, issues that still confront us, that are still pressing on us. It's time for an America that deeply values liberty. We deeply value liberty. To achieve at least a portion of the promise Mill saw in the Industrial Revolution, to go back to that discussion about what's going to come out of this. It's time for an America that deeply values liberty to reconsider the institutional structures of her workplaces. Thank you.
All right, welcome back. I'm Peter Demarneff on the philosophy faculty the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. Ross kindly asked me to moderate this session, but I'm not exactly sure what a moderator does in this context. So I'm just going to ask you each question that occurred to me when I was listening to you, and then maybe that will generate discussion that I can then moderate. Sandy, first I wanted to ask you about what you see as the connection in Mill's thought between his ideas of self-development, development of the capacities, and the kind of cooperative work situations that Joe was talking about.
Yeah.
Joe emphasized liberty. He didn't emphasize so much human development. And so I was wondering what you had to say about that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Mill thinks that people are essentially social, but their social capacity isn't fully developed in mid-19th century Britain. It's developing and they're getting more and more able to understand their interrelationships and the injustices that exist under some institutional arrangements, the Irish absentee landlord, for instance. And I think Joe is right that he is optimistic, although I'm not sure I'd go quite as far as Joe, in the sense that he thinks people will improve themselves. And they will improve themselves through trade, through discussion. So those are the two things that I talked about a lot, but also through political interactions. And they can make institutions better. And as they make them better, they can choose to become better people. And so I guess that's how I would address that question.
So as I seem to recall that in some places, Mill might have argued that greater control over the factory, the labor, was actually itself necessary to develop the capacities. Do you think that's an accurate characterization of his view or not?
So I think it could be. I mean, it's not necessarily the only means to improving oneself, but it's one important one, I think. So that wage relationship, that trampling, crushing wage relationship that exists, coupled with a marriage institution that is basically really crummy at the time. So women could not exit a marriage because they couldn't own property outside of marriage, and so that's why he writes that marriage is a form of slavery, and so if that could be improved, and if some other, as I say, these very bad institutional arrangements could be improved, and he foresaw that they would be, people would improve them, and he was right on marriage. So there's a reason for that optimism, I think. Now, on whether people will become so social that they will willingly give up the means of production and enter into, on a wide scale. I do think he sees that as something very far in the future. So he talks about, these things can be tried on a small scale, and then if they work, they'll be copied.
So Joe, what do you see as the relationship between what you call positive liberty and what we might call workplace democracy or workplace cooperatives and human development in Mill's sense?
I think Mill was excited that this transition was largely going to occur spontaneously.
Yeah.
Mill was not in favor, nor did he anticipate in Britain that there would be a major violent revolution of some sort or another, nor did he look to the state to make this transition. He saw it largely as voluntary, but also spontaneous. Mill is a strong advocate of competition, so he doesn't have some of this utopian quality that some socialists eventually put forward. That said, he thought participation at work was a major part of people's lives. For that matter, Adam Smith also has this beautiful passage after he talks about the division of labor and all that earlier in the book. He comes back and he says, well, the modern workplace is just terrible.
Yeah.
And he says, well, maybe we can get a little education or a little activity outside of work. But Mill says he was also, I should say, moved by the events in France in 1848. There were efforts to establish cooperatives during that 1848 revolution in France, which is right when he's writing his book. Okay, all of that said, ultimately he wants people to be able to develop their own selves, and work is part of that. Being actively engaged at work is part of that. That is going to make people better because they will have to talk to each other. I don't know, all of us academics, we have a lot of this. It's strange. Well, let me say, you know, if you're not tenure track, maybe you don't, right? Maybe, right? But if you're tenure track, there's all this joint governance and all this that we take for granted. And I think Mill would be very positive about that kind of activity. And he would think, although sometimes in the faculty senate you might doubt it, that it makes people better people.
I'll just say that as a dean, I'm not so sure. Just kidding. In case my faculty see that. Just kidding.
So coming at the topic of worker cooperatives from a different direction, something else I seem to recall is that Mill acknowledged that that worker-run companies might be less efficient, might be less productive, might be less profitable. That raises the possibility that they would actually reduce economic growth and therefore human welfare in the aggregate. And so, I mean, Nozick has one kind of argument against some of Mill's policies. Another one might be that, in fact, they will actually reduce human welfare over time.
So,
Go ahead.
yeah. So Mill, I mean, when Mill addresses this, first he says, well, you might have expected me to be in favor of a return to small producers, because after all, an independent small producer has a great deal of freedom in their work. They control their work. But he says the world's changed. He's talking about the Industrial Revolution. He's talking about Adam Smith and the division of labor and the economies of scale that have been so dramatic in our lives. So he doesn't want to go back to that. On the other hand, maybe it's just a little too convenient, but he does think that this is spontaneously going to move in the direction that he's predicting. As such, yes, perhaps they won't be quite as productive. He's talking about this all happening in the stationary state. I might say, though, on this question of the timeline, he does say in his chapter on profits that we're within a hair's breadth of the profit rate going to zero. Although he was very aware of the possibility of counter tendencies. Indeed, Marx probably stole most of that from Mill, although he never acknowledges Mill. But he says we're within a hair's breadth. It could go the other way. It might not. But so at least the possibility of this being a serious development is clearly there in his mind. And you can see why it would be attractive to him.
The only thing I would add is that work is not good for John Stuart Mill. So if it ends up that in the stationary state, there is stationarity, he does allow for other things that can be changing. So he doesn't have a kind of simple-minded view of GDP. He's got human welfare and flourishing in a much different or more complicated setting than ordinary economics would put it today.
So one reason why things might not spontaneously move in this direction is that workers themselves might come to believe that they'll actually make more per hour if their companies are managed by experts in a hierarchical system. And then, do you think Mill would have some objection to that trade-off?
Go ahead.
I think Mill is anticipating the possibility, not the certainty, and he would be the first one to admit it because he says there's two sides to every issue, that people would get to the point where their wages had risen enough, as I discussed, that they would not see that as the only end of their lives.
Yeah.
That their lives are going to be multifaceted. So given that, I think, yes, he would want to see people putting weight on other things. So, for example, one of the things he's very clear about when we talk about the stationary state is there's going to be a huge change in the research that goes on, perhaps in universities and elsewhere in the world, that the research now is going to be much more concerned with improving the benefit in people's lives and less concerned with how to make an extra dollar in the short run. Now, to some extent, those may overlap, but to some extent they may not. And he was hopeful that research would take a somewhat different tack.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Maybe, should we open it up, Ross? Should we open it up to questions? Sure. All right. Do we have any questions from the floor? I will yeah.
I've heard fables anyway that British workers during, say, the 1870s, 1880s, would work their 10-hour days, 6 days a week, and then go to study groups where they studied principally Mill's principles of political economy. If this is true, was this an encouraging sign for Mill?
It was definitely true for some. Mill, and then also Harriet Taylor's daughter, Helen Taylor, was active in that kind of worker education. The Fabians, when they come along in the early 20th century, well, late 19th, early 20th century, are very eager to encourage worker education. I doubt that every worker was going to school every night, but it was a new thing to be able to do that and to have the tools to do it. And Mill was looked on as the classic sympathetic political economist.
I'll just add very quickly, in 1882, William Stanley Jevons writes Married Women in Factories. And there you get a somewhat different picture where, these women are getting up, they're feeding their young children, dropping them off at a very primitive kind of daycare arrangement. Give the kid some Godfrey, which is laudanum, a dose of that to keep it quiet for 12 hours. Go to the factory, work in the factory, come home, pick up the kid, feed the kid, and then give it more Godfrey so it'll sleep all night. So there's an entire generation of children raised on laudanum. So it wasn't all rosy.
I think also relevant to that was the whole development of worker education that then moved into higher education, the London School of Economics.
Yes.
That was set up by the Fabians and explicitly with a wave to Mill, and that we're going to continue the serious development of economics and also make it open to a large segment of the population.
Yeah.
So what differentiates Mill from a utopian?
Oh. Well, he is, I guess he's very realistic in his conversations with Harriet and in the principles about the French socialists, the utopian socialists, and his argument is that human nature being what it is, those schemes will not work today. Now, he does have this very optimistic side, whether we call it utopian or but sometime in the future, we may improve ourselves. I don't know, I think a utopian, I think of them as having, some sort of institutional arrangement that just gets dropped into human arrangements, and then everything is wonderful. This is humans themselves improving themselves as individuals, not as, sort of not imposed from the top.
And I think he explicitly says that what we need is a new system that can emerge piece by piece that you can experiment with.
Yeah.
So when he's talking about these cooperatives, he's seeing them initially as in competition with existing firms. He says any socialist, and he's talking about the Continentals especially, any socialist who says they have a scheme and they're going to put it into action the day after the revolution is just telling stories. So he's very hostile to that, and he does believe in experimentation, demonstration. After all, that's how capitalism came up in the first place. But whether he was too optimistic, you might be right.
Hi. Sandra, you drew a distinction between no choice or extremely limited choice, and then the other option was choice. And I'm just wondering, did Mill ever talk about like the size of the set of choice that was
Yeah.
amenable to human development, or?
So that's a great point, and it's really, I think why it's so hard to pin Mill down. So one needs to have, I use the word fulsome, a fulsome set of choices, and, not be weighed upon by public opinion. But, is it all right for someone to live in a society in which there's a seatbelt law? And then, how many of those laws then are too many? So I wouldn't say I can pin Mill down any better than anyone else can, except that I think, what he wants, so he says you have to be able to observe, to discern, to compare, to make a choice, to foresee the future effects of the choice, to stick to your choice. So you have to. It has to be enough so that those things are actually cognitively happening. I think in a a person's day-to-day life. Beyond that, I don't know that I could pin him down.
So I just want to ask a question. You probably know what I'm going to ask, or what it's about. But in his book on the Taylor-Mill relationship, and in your edited volume on that same book, I don't think that Hayek makes the claim necessarily that Mill is attracted to feminism in virtue of Taylor, the relationship with Taylor. Isn't it more? I mean, isn't it more that Hayek's view is that he becomes sort of a soft-minded rationalist, whereas he had been a hardcore empiricist.
He certainly makes that point, but he also, I think he makes the claim that Harriet kind of pushes him in the direction of looking at women's issues. And,
Right.
and to me, it seems pretty clear that, as early as 1830, Mill has those views pretty much intact.
My question, though, is that this sort of move into the direction of what Hayek would think a soft-minded rationalism, how does that relate to this argument for the future of the work relationship being cooperative?
So it's clear if you read the different editions of the Principles and you read the letters beside them, it's clear that Harriet and John Stuart are having a conversation about the passages that relate to the French utopians especially, but some other issues as well. And she forces him to explain some of the paragraphs and to change some. She induces. I shouldn't say she forces him. Some of the paragraphs where he'll write back to her and he'll say, well, I put that too strongly. In fact, it's I don't. you say that everybody is perfect. I'm not quite there, but I think they'll improve. So those kinds of letters. That's not obviously not exact quotes, but kind of the sense of the correspondence. So I think she, I don't know that she made him change his mind so much as she really encouraged him to be very clear about where he was in each specific edition. And she wrote things too.
I must say too, I've never fully understood what he meant by a hardcore rationalist. But somehow it seemed to have something to do with bureaucracy or something in the background. But Mill is more, what? I think in these respects he has a romantic side to him. And his fondness for cooperatives doesn't strike me that it comes from some hardcore rationalist position, but rather from this notion that we can get there and it will happen spontaneously, and history is on the side of the vast majority of people. Which feels a little romantic, maybe a little utopian, I don't know.
Yeah.
A couple of principles that libertarians rely on are A, the non-aggression principle, and B, self-ownership. Did Mill talk in those terms at all?
In both terms, yes. So the distinction that Joe alluded to at the beginning, certainly a non-aggression principle. And he says that in On Liberty, he says one should not be allowed to sell oneself into slavery. So that's a contract that he does not think should be made or should be, he thinks it should be voided.
Quick follow-up. Did he ever suggest that the non-aggression principle applied to taxation?
He's very careful about taxation. He goes, I don't want to say he's inconsistent, but he clearly in the here and now, he thinks taxation should be minimized so that laissez-faire can achieve the most rapid accumulation of capital possible. And he strongly endorses laissez-faire in that sense. But he also has this vision that eventually things are going to change. And when they change, and most owners of wealth are going to be rentiers, he clearly is softer on taxation. He says, well, at this point, taxation to improve the infrastructure of Ireland, for example, might be a useful exercise. Once the people we're talking about are no longer pushing the engine of development. So I think there's a logic to it, but he does offer arguments on both sides.
Hi. So do you personally think it's true that Mill and Harriet were just friends before her husband died?
I don't think it particularly matters that much because they were shunned anyway. But I will say they knew all their letters would be read, and so and they knew that what the cost would be of the relationship, and so, like I said, I don't think it particularly matters because they bore the cost one way or the other.
We're going to stop here. We need to end. Thank you very much. Thank you. Please join me in thanking Sandra and Joe for being with us. Have a good evening.